The smell of burnt grease and old coal dust usually meant home. But today, it smelled like a trap. Marlin stood in the center of her father's diner, her knuckles white as she gripped a hidden leather folder she'd just pried from behind a basement wall. Outside, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the porch echoed like a heartbeat, and the first seized sticker was slapped onto the front window, bright yellow and mocking against the gray Appalachian fog. The bell above the door shrieked as the sheriff forced his way in, but Marlin wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on a single line of her father's shaky handwriting in the ledger, a secret debt that turned her hero into a stranger and her life into a lie. As the deputies began tagging the stools where she'd sat since she was 5, she realized the man she was fighting wasn't just the banker at the door, but the ghost of the man whose portrait still hung behind the bar. She had 48 hours to save the building, or the truth would bury her deeper than the mines ever could. The gray dawn over Beckley didn't break so much as it congealed. A thick, suffocating blanket of coal dust and Appalachian fog that clung to the lungs. Marlin Hargrove stood on a rickety stepladder outside the coal lantern, her knuckles white as she gripped the rough bristles of a scrub brush. Every rhythmic stroke against the faded crimson wood sent a cloud of fine soot into the air, a stinging grit that settled in her eyelashes and coated her tongue with the familiar, metallic tang of the valley. She watched the slurry of gray water trail down her forearms, leaving pale streaks on her skin like scars. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. If she stopped, the decay of the town would finally catch up to the building, and the coal lantern would vanish into the same ash-colored oblivion as the men who used to frequent it. Underneath the grime, the ghost of her father's legacy began to peek through. The chipped, hand-painted letters of the sign that had once promised the best coffee in West Virginia. Her muscles screamed with a dull, throbbing ache, a protest against the double shifts and the endless war against the mountain's refuse. But she leaned into the motion. The rhythmic scrape of wood on stone was the only thing keeping the silence of the dying town at bay. She could hear the distant, tectonic groan of the valley waking up, the sound of rusted trucks turning over, and the hollow wind whistling through the skeletons of the closed collieries. By the time the first pot of coffee began to hiss and gurgle on the stove, the interior of the diner was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of buzzing fluorescent tubes. Marlin moved with a mechanical precision born of necessity, filling chipped mugs for old Billy and Sam the mechanic. The steam rose in sluggish ribbons, mingling with the heavy scent of frying bacon grease. She paused for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, and reached for the heavy oak frame she had set on the counter. With a hammer she kept behind the register, she drove a single nail into the wall directly above the till. The sound was sharp, a gunshot in the quiet room. She hung the portrait of James Hargrove with a steady hand. He looked down at the dining room with a stern, unyielding gaze, his coal miner's shoulders squared, a man who had been the bedrock of this community. Marlin traced a thumb over the glass, catching a stray smudge on his lapel. She felt a phantom weight behind her, a prickle on the back of her neck that made her want to turn and ask him if the bacon was crisp enough, or if the books would finally balance this month. The regulars nodded to the picture as they shuffled in, a silent tribute to a man who had died with his boots on and his reputation intact. Marlin straightened her collar, her spine stiffening. This place was all she had left of him, a fortress of wood and grease against a world that wanted to forget they ever existed. The peace lasted only as long as it took for the bell above the door to jangle with a violent, metallic shriek. A postman, his uniform darkened by the morning drizzle, stepped in and dropped a thick, cream-colored envelope on the counter. It looked out of place against the formica. Too clean, too official. Marlin wiped her palms on a rag before picking it up. The paper crinkled, a dry, ominous sound. And as she tore the edge, the word foreclosure leapt off the page in bold, uncompromising ink. The air left her lungs in a sudden, painful rush. Her eyes raced across the legal jargon, skipping over the whereas and henceforth, until they landed on the date. It was an eviction notice, immediate and final. The red ink of the bank's stamp seemed to bleed into the paper, blurring before her eyes. Her fingers spasmed, crushing the document into a jagged ball of parchment. Around her, the clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversation continued. But for Marlin, the world had gone deafeningly silent. She felt as though she were standing at the bottom of a mine shaft, watching the last sliver of light vanish as the earth caved in. She lunged for the rotary phone behind the bar, her breath coming in ragged hitches. The plastic receiver felt cold and slick against her ear as she dialed the number for Graham Wilson's office. She had known Graham since she was a child. He had been her father's partner, the man who had stood by the casket and promised her that the Hargrove name would always mean something in Beckley. But the voice that answered wasn't Graham's. It was a secretary. Her tone as dry and brittle as autumn leaves, reciting a script about busy schedules and prior engagements. "Tell him it's Marlin," she rasped, her voice cracking. "Tell him they're taking the lantern. He's on the council. He can stop this. My father helped him build." The line went dead. A dial tone buzzed in her ear, a flat, mocking drone. Marlin slowly lowered the receiver, her knees trembling so violently she had to lean against the sticky counter to stay upright. Her gaze fell on Graham's business card, tucked under the edge of the register. Gold embossed, elegant, a symbol of the man he had become, while she stayed behind in the coal dust. In a sudden burst of white-hot fury, she swiped the card off the counter, watching it flutter into the trash. The betrayal tasted like bile, bitter and hot in the back of her throat. Driven by a desperate, frantic energy, she grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight, descending into a darkness that smelled of damp earth and rot. The single bulb overhead flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the rusted shelves. She began to heave heavy boxes aside, the dust billowing up in gray veils that made her chest seize with a coughing fit. She was looking for the old ledgers, the ones with her father's cramped, meticulous handwriting. She found them at the bottom of a cedar chest, the leather covers slick with mildew. Sinking onto the cold concrete floor, Marlin surrounded herself with the ghosts of her father's finances. The light of the flashlight wavered as she turned the pages, searching for a mistake, a missed payment, anything that could explain the bank's sudden aggression. The numbers were a labyrinth of debt and dwindling margins. But as she reached the back of the 2018 ledger, she noticed something odd. A ventilation grate in the corner of the room sat slightly askew, one of its screws missing. She pulled a paring knife from her pocket and pried at the metal plate. It groaned, a screech of protesting iron, before popping free. Tucked deep inside the cobwebbed niche was a leather folder. Marlin pulled it out, her skin crawling as she felt the weight of it. Inside was a document she had never seen, a private mortgage agreement, signed not by a bank, but by Graham Wilson. Her father's signature was there too, but it looked different. Shaky, the ink bleeding in a way that suggested a hand that didn't want to move. She carried the paper back upstairs to the light of the kitchen. As she read, the reality of her life began to dissolve. The coal lantern hadn't just been struggling. It had been a stake in a high-stakes game. The document detailed a series of private loans, debts incurred at underground gambling dens, with the diner listed as collateral. The dates matched the nights her father used to come home late, smelling of stale smoke and cheap whiskey, claiming he'd been at the union meetings. Marlin pressed her palms to her temples, trying to stop the world from spinning. The man she had worshipped, the man whose portrait she had just hung with such pride, had gambled away her roof and her floor. He had lied to her for years, smiling over breakfast while he signed away her future. The image of the honest James Hargrove shattered, leaving behind a jagged, ugly truth that cut her to the bone. The sound of tires screeching on the gravel outside snapped her back to the present. She looked through the grease-streaked window to see two white sedans with blue stripes pulling up to the curb. Men in suits and sheriff's deputies in tactical jackets stepped out, carrying clipboards like weapons. The lead man, a representative from the bank with a tie that cost more than Marlin's car, adjusted his glasses and started toward the door. Marlin felt a surge of adrenaline that burned through her shock. She didn't think. She moved. She reached the door just as the representative's hand touched the knob. She slammed the deadbolt home and braced her body against the wood. "You can't come in!" she screamed through the glass, her voice echoing in the empty diner. "I have the records. There's a mistake." "Miss Hargrove," the man called out, his voice muffled but dripping with a practiced, condescending patience. "We have a court order for the appraisal and seizure of assets. Please open the door, or we will be forced to remove it." "Try it," she yelled, her fingers digging into the doorframe. She saw the deputies moving toward the side entrance, their heavy boots thudding on the porch like a funeral march. She ran for the kitchen, grabbing the heavy iron handle of the stove as if she could anchor the building to the earth with her own weight. She watched them through the service window as they entered through the back, their faces impassive, their eyes already cataloging the value of her father's fryers and the old jukebox. They moved like locusts, slapping yellow adhesive tags on everything she touched. "Property of the state, seized." The stickers were everywhere. On the backs of the stools where she had sat as a child, on the espresso machine she had spent 3 months' salary to repair. Marlin stood in the center of the room, clutching the leather folder to her chest, her eyes darting between the intruders. She felt a cold, hard knot of resolve forming in her gut. She wasn't just losing a business. She was being erased. As the deputies moved into the back office, Marlin retreated to a corner table, spreading the stolen document under the harsh light. She ignored the sound of the men moving her furniture, her focus narrowing down to the ink. She pulled out a magnifying glass she used for the fine print on invoices and leaned in. The signature on the March 14th addendum caught her eye. It was James Hargrove's name, but the J didn't loop the right way. The H was too sharp. She pulled out her father's old checkbook and compared them. Her heart skipped. On March 14th, her father had been in the hospital with a broken leg after a fall in the cellar. He couldn't have signed a legal document in Graham's office. She looked closer. The ink was a slightly different shade of blue. It wasn't just a bad signature, it was a forgery. Graham hadn't just lent her father money. He had waited until James was incapacitated to secure the diner for himself. He hadn't been a benefactor. He had been a vulture. Marlin stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. She didn't wait for the deputies to finish. She grabbed her coat and the folder, pushing past a man who was trying to tag the register. "I'm going to the council office," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And if any of this is moved before I get back, I'll burn this place down with you in it." The walk to the city hall was a blur of gray slush and biting wind. She didn't feel the cold. She burst through the double doors of the municipal building, her boots leaving muddy tracks on the polished marble. The security guard tried to intercept her, but she moved with a ferocity that made him hesitate. She reached Graham's office and threw the doors open without knocking. Graham Wilson was sitting behind a mahogany desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. He was looking at a set of blueprints, a silver pen poised in his hand. He didn't look up immediately, his sedie volacy perfectly in place, the scent of expensive cologne fighting the smell of the rain she brought with her. "Marlin," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "I heard about the bank. I'm truly sorry. I did everything I could." "You did everything you could to steal it," she spat, slamming the forged document onto his desk. The paper slid across the polished surface, hitting his silver inkwell with a sharp clink. Graham finally looked up. His gray eyes were as cold as the mountain streams in February. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at her, his face a mask of disappointment. "Marlin, you're upset. You aren't thinking clearly. I'm thinking about the fact that my father was in a hospital bed when you signed this," she said, leaning over the desk until she could see the pores in his skin. "I'm thinking about how much a judge is going to love seeing your handwriting next to a forged signature of a dying man." Graham's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched, a telltale sign she remembered from the poker games they used to play in her kitchen. He slowly leaned back, his chair creaking. "The diner is a relic, Marlin. It's a tombstone for a town that doesn't want to be dead anymore." He reached out and unrolled the blueprints he had been studying. "This is the future. The Beckley Commons. A shopping center, a cinema. Jobs that don't involve digging in the dirt." Marlin looked down at the map. A blue line ran directly through the corner of Main and 4th. Her diner was gone, replaced by a parking lot for a department store. The scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. He wasn't just taking her building. He was paving over the heart of the town to line his own pockets. "You're a thief, Graham," just like everyone said. "I'm a visionary," he corrected her, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And you are a girl holding onto a sinking ship. Go home, Marlin. Take whatever the bank gives you and leave. It's over." She left his office not in defeat, but in a state of cold, crystalline clarity. As she walked back to the lantern, she saw the progress already beginning. A crew in orange vests was erecting a high wooden fence around her property, the sound of hammers ringing out like nails in a coffin. They were literalizing the wall he was building between her and her life. She tried to call the union, the old miners, anyone who had loved her father. But the responses were always the same. A sudden silence, a mumbled excuse, the click of a hanging phone. Graham's reach was everywhere. He had promised the town a future, and in exchange, they were willing to let him bury the past. The final blow came that evening. Her brother, Thomas, walked into the darkened diner. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He set a thick envelope on the counter. "Graham sent this," Thomas whispered. "It's 50,000. It's enough to get you to Charleston, Marlin. To start over." Marlin felt the air turn to ice. "He bought you, Thomas. He's tearing down our father's life, and you're taking his silver?" "Our father was a drunk and a gambler," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. "He didn't leave us a legacy. He left us a cage. Take the money, Marlin, please, before he takes everything else." A sudden smell of smoke drifted through the room. Marlin turned to the kitchen and saw a flicker of orange behind the grill. A grease fire, too sudden, too convenient. As she ran for the extinguisher, she saw Thomas move. He didn't help her with the fire. He lunged for the safe she had left open, grabbing the leather folder and the black ledgers. "Thomas, no!" she screamed, the chemical foam from the extinguisher clouding the air. He didn't look back. He vanished through the back door, into the rain. Marlin stumbled after him, her lungs burning, but by the time she reached the alley, The taillights of a black sedan were already disappearing into the fog. She stood in the rain, the soot from the fire mixing with the water on her face. She was alone. No documents, no brother, no lights, no water. Graham's men had already cut the lines. The diner was a cold, dark shell. But as she sat on the floor of the basement that night, shivering in the dark, her hand brushed against a loose stone near the foundation. She felt a hollow space. She reached in and pulled out 2 more books, the real ledgers. Her father hadn't been the only one hiding things. These were Graham's personal accounts, the ones he had kept when he was still the mine's accountant. She spent the night reading by the light of a single candle. She saw the truth now. It wasn't just gambling. Graham had been siphoning the miners' pension fund for years. He hadn't built his empire on vision. He had built it on the stolen retirement of every man in the valley. The next morning, the day of the town hall meeting, Marlin didn't go to a lawyer. She didn't go to the police. She cleaned the soot from her face, put on her father's old leather jacket, and walked toward the theater where the council was meeting. She found Graham in the wings of the stage just before he was set to speak. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "I thought you'd be halfway to the coast by now, Marlin." "I found the pension records, Graham," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like the marble statues he admired. He tried to speak, but she cut him off, leaning in close. "I could go out there and tell them. I could show them how you stole their grandfathers' lives. They'd tear this building down with you inside it." Graham's eyes darted toward the curtain, where the murmur of the crowd was growing louder. "If you do that," he hissed, "I'll release the records of your father's thefts. He wasn't just a gambler, Marlin. He was my partner. He signed the vouchers. You'll save their money, but you'll turn him into the most hated man in the history of this state." "Is that the legacy you want?" Marlin froze. The choice was a jagged blade in her heart. Save the diner and her father's name, or save the people? She looked through the curtain. She saw old Billy in the front row, his lungs rattling with black lung, waiting for the promise of a better town. She saw the widows. She saw the children. She stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, a white wall of heat. The crowd went silent. Graham stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of fake comfort. "I have something to say," Marlin began, her voice echoing through the rafters. She looked at Graham. She looked at the papers in her hand, the proof of his guilt and her father's shame. She saw the hunger in the eyes of the townsfolk. She didn't reveal the truth, not all of it. "I'm here to announce that Graham Wilson has agreed to a private settlement," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, hard strength. "He is personally guaranteeing the full restoration of the miners' pension fund, effective immediately. And the coal lantern. The lantern will remain open as a historical landmark, under my sole ownership." A roar of confusion, and then cheers erupted. Graham's grip on her shoulder tightened until it bruised, but he had no choice. He forced a smile and nodded to the crowd. He was trapped. He would have to pay, or he would lose everything. Marlin walked off the stage before the applause ended. She went back to the diner and built a fire in the old potbelly stove. She took the records, the proof of Graham's crimes and her father's betrayal, and she watched them burn. She watched the names and the numbers turn to ash, the only evidence of the rot at the heart of Beckley disappearing into the chimney. She had saved the town. She had saved the diner. But as she stood behind the counter the next morning, pouring coffee for men who called her father a hero, she felt the weight of the silence. She was the only one who knew the truth. She was the keeper of the lie that kept the town alive. Outside, the coal dust continued to fall, a slow gray rain that covered everything in a layer of beautiful, deceptive ash. Marlin gripped the handle of the coffee pot, her knuckles white, and waited for the next customer.